Good morning. I'm Manisha Palta, and welcome to today's keynote session. As a reminder, you can participate in polls and ask questions by going to meetings.astro.org. Dr. Theodore Goldstein is a scientist-engineer who develops computational systems to transform society and healthcare. Dr. Goldstein spent 25 years in the computer industry developing ubiquitous products including Apple's iPhone and smart cards used in all credit cards. After his computer career, Dr. Goldstein returned to UC Santa Cruz to earn a PhD in bioinformatics and biomolecular engineering to bring the power of computing to healthcare. He went on into a second career in healthcare on the faculty of UCSC, UCSF, and then became the Chief Artificial Intelligence Officer at Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield. He left Anthem last year to join public service on the Accessibility and Affordability Working Group of the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine. I'm honored to welcome Dr. Goldstein to speak to us about precision care, innovation, and artificial intelligence. Dr. Goldstein.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Poulter. It's so great to be here, and it's truly an honor to be talking about my favorite topic of artificial intelligence to some of my favorite people, gastroenterologists. And I think this is a great opportunity to have a peek at the future and really to explore a little bit of how precision medicine and precision care is going and how innovation and artificial intelligence can improve these things. But first I'm going to begin with a dad joke. I know it's early in the morning. So what do oncologists and spreadsheets, like Microsoft Excel, have in common? What do they do? What do they both do? They both kill cells. It's a dad joke. Not a great joke. But at least you have something to go home and tell the kids. Or mom joke. Okay, so we're going to go and hit three topics today. We're going to talk about innovation, and especially innovation platforms. And platforms I'm going to define in its broadest possible sense. And I'll discuss that. And then I'm going to give you a brief primer on artificial intelligence with examples in healthcare. And of course, everybody uses AI, and when you use Google Maps or you go shopping on the web. But I'm going to go into some greater detail about how it impacts in healthcare. And then I'm going to talk about some opportunities that I see for innovation using these concepts in precision medicine, in everything that you do day in and day out, and how it's really going to evolve in the next decade. So to motivate this, let me begin by a slide from the National Center for Health Statistics. Yesterday you heard from Dr. Robin Yazdoff about all of the impact of COVID. And these are the same people. And I thought it was really interesting to step back and really see the whole sweep of time from 1930 to now of how well there is the steady improvement really since 1950 for females, and really since the mid-'80s for males in this. And that kind of a line is amazing. That's an amazing line of really steady, hard work on all of your part. And I really want to say, not as an oncologist myself, but as an outsider, a data person, that this is a very impressive work, right? And a lot to be proud of. And that kind of impressive work really shows dedication to bringing innovations, to working hard, to sweating the details, right? And you can see that in this very steady slope. And if you extrapolate down from this, from its current very impressive levels, right, of how the mortality has improved, you see that, in fact, that we get to zero, where essentially it becomes merely a chronic disease and no longer a lethal disease, that it concludes in about in 2077 for females and 2088 for males. And that's, of course, assuming just a straight line. These types of things require innovations constantly. And perhaps, if the innovation is good enough and stellar enough, then you actually see a sharp decrease, that you get it decades sooner. And I think that's the opportunity here. That's what we're talking about here, is can there be innovations, not just in terms of incremental, but dramatic. To begin, I'm going to talk about what I mean by disruptive innovations. All right? And Apple's iPhone is my favorite example of it, something I've had a small hand in. Last time I was in this room, Steve Jobs was announcing the iPhone on this stage, and it's interesting to be here with you in the same context discussing the topic 15 years later. And what's exciting to me about this is that this is a great example of a platform. And as a platform, it brings people together. It brings a focus of innovation in common among people who are both working for, in this case, Apple, and people who are working on other ideas, but who see in this platform a vehicle to get their ideas out into the world. And I think that's critically important in what we're trying to accomplish here. Because as you work together with your colleagues, as you work across industries from medical to pharma to insurance to healthcare in general, right? It's how do you bring these people together into a common framework of understanding. And I think that's just incredibly helpful to think about this. The problem, of course, is that these types of platforms are very expensive to develop. Apple spent $2.6 billion to make the iPhone. Recently, we saw, of course, with COVID, that Moderna, to bring mRNA to its incredible use in vaccines, they spent $2.5 billion to develop it. And in California here, we're funding the stem cell research to the tune of $8.5 billion. So when you see this mass aggregation of money putting a promise to the future, you're seeing something that can unfold, that we hope will unfold in many exciting ways. And I think both mRNA as a vaccine and stem cells will be exciting. And I'll get back to that later in this talk. So to begin with, I want to talk about how all digital innovation, and AI, of course, is an example of that, digital innovation always goes through a process. And this is probably the most important slide of my entire talk today. It goes through a series of steps. In this case, keeping with the theme of the same sounding words, digitalization, deception, disruptive, dematerializing, demonetizing, democratizing. Digitalization, obvious what that means. Deceptive. You can be fooled that, gee, it's not such an important thing. And then you get this disruptive phase where things change. You may be frustrated by that. There's this dematerialization phase where what was physically there before now becomes virtualized. Then there's this demonetization phase. That could be something where, in fact, something that used to charge for, you charge for in an entirely different way, as we've all seen with ride services like Lyft and Uber, or it disappears entirely, as we've seen with email and social networking and so on. And then there's this democratization phase where everybody is doing it. It's universal. It's just part of the assumption. And in healthcare, you've seen the digitalization phase. Both EMR and precision medicine are great examples of that. Obviously, you've all felt this amazing frustration at the EMR systems, and I'm sorry about that. On the disruptive side, one of the exciting things that we've seen with COVID is telehealth. And that's really kind of astounding that in 18 weeks, we accomplished more than we accomplished in the previous 18 years in telehealth. And obviously, this was a technology whose time was ready, but where the people and the practitioners weren't ready for it. And of course, required economic changes, both at the federal level and at the insurance company levels to support that. And extremely important for that to happen. I think there's something very similar happening in both wearables and especially in remote patient monitoring. And I'll talk a lot about that. AI is the centerpiece. I'll skip that forward, though, to talk about demonetization. And what's happening here is that paying for outcomes is something that's going to become increasingly important. This is part of the Affordable Care Act and to have value-based care. And that's a really important part of what we see as outcome-based reimbursements and paying for benefit. And I think this is obviously something which we feel uncomfortable about, but which is coming, and which we need to build the infrastructures and ideas and systems in place. And there's enormous opportunity in that happening. Of course, what we want is healthier, very empowered patients, patients who are in control of their health, who take proactive steps. And I think that all of this is going to happen. But let's focus in now on artificial intelligence. I think that's the really critical part of what we're trying to talk about today. AI started in the 1950s. As computers became available, even in the old mainframe days, people at MIT were building rule-based systems. These were based on ideas that actually Alan Turing, the inventor of computing, came up with. And it was a notion that computers could mimic human intelligence. Not that they were exactly doing what humans do, although obviously in fiction we spend a lot of time talking about R2-D2 and robots and even both positive and negative, Terminator and so on. In fact, really we're talking about something more at the level of game-playing programs. And we've all played a little bit of chess and been frustrated or not frustrated, or as you will. A revolution happened in the mid-70s where we began a new concept of bringing statistical and probabilistic reasoning. So before this, it was if, then, else, very much the type of flowcharts that you see in healthcare. With machine learning, what we did was we actually applied statistical reasoning to the data. And this is essentially where it isn't a human coming up with and embodying the ideas, but it's having the algorithms learn. The simplest of that is, of course, just regression, drawing a line through a set of data points. That can be automated with just a little bit of calculus. More complicated rules, where there are multiple states and you don't have very much data, you can do other statistical inferring techniques. But it really wasn't until about 2010 that a big breakthrough happened, and that was in deep learning. And this is what we see now driving all electronic commerce. And it's based on technologies of neural nets, which before were beginning to get, during the machine learning phase, weren't all that interesting. Because of a greater compute power and some important realizations about how to structure the algorithms, we realized that we could do amazing compute over millions and billions of data points and build extremely very large networks. One of the things that's happened, of course, is the AI gives an answer. What does it mean? And especially in healthcare, where by definition you're trained to be very skeptical of a black box thinking, we've created this new subfield even of deep learning called explainable AI. And that's where we map the artificial intelligence to human comprehensible explanations, where it's the AI is not just simply saying, take this medication, but the AI is actually giving the physician or giving the practitioner a concept of why it explains it and what are the human recognizable features. In some fields, such as electronic commerce, we don't care why. The answer is, somebody buys an Africa stroller or a Toyota or whatever. But in clinical health of care, of course, you have a requirement to be the defender of truth and correctness, and so that explainable AI is extremely important. Diving down a little bit, the code that you see, perhaps you've done a little programming. These are human-created logic rules. But with data-driven probabilistic machine learning, there's something that happens that allows us to see things that no human being maybe perhaps knew before. And this is the ability to discover from the data itself properties and features of reality that aren't obvious and would not necessarily occur to people. The exciting thing here is that, in fact, that the machine can often see features and patterns that no human being would ever comprehend. Perhaps once the machine points it out, we can then begin to run experiments, begin to see patterns. Nowhere is this proven to be more true than in radiological understanding. Because our brains evolved to identify threats and opportunities for eating and sex, right? That brain isn't particularly good at seeing grains of sand, seeing grains and textures of things. And so the great opportunity here is for probabilistic rule-based systems to drive discovery that no human mind would have comprehended. And that, to me, is the benefit that AI brings to medicine that no amount of experimentation without AI could have happened. So what is being learned, right? And what's being learned here is the nodes of a graph. And the interpretation of this graph is essentially a set of how the computer creates weights and factors based on evidence. Obviously, if you've gone to medical school in the last 20 years, you've been taught to be a Bayesian reasoner and to think about the probability. Each of these nodes is doing Bayesian induction. And it's doing it at a scale of data integration far beyond any human can do, where it's learning thousands and thousands and thousands of nodes. So how much data do you need, right? And it really depends upon the number of input classes, how broad the disease is, how many input features there are, how much data there is to be assumed from and learned from, and then what is the number of model parameters? How do you actually want the answer to come out? Is it simply a better than average, worse than average prognosis, or is it actually a decision and choice between perhaps dozens of different therapies? In my own work, we've been looking at diabetes and how that goes. And one of the astounding things is that in diabetes, for example, there is over 160 combinations of medications currently and actively being prescribed, right? That is a phenomenal number, far beyond human minds can cope with. Coming up with an optimal ordering for a given patient or for a given class of patients is an AI problem, for example. So, physicians, you have a responsibility. You have a very important role here, and that is that the AI cannot be left unmanaged. This is like a self-driving car. Somebody must be behind the wheel, active, making sure that the car is ready and is making correct decisions, and if it does, for it to take over. And that process is no different than in any other medication process. I think humans are not going out of the loop in any time that I can foresee in the future. I think AIs need to be managed. They are a tool. They are not a replacement for people. And what this means is that you need to ensure that how the algorithm was developed, that you have some comprehension of it, much as you would review a clinical trial. And the FDA is, in fact, putting in place guidelines right now to manage artificial intelligence as a medical device. And I think this is very good. And part of that as well is to understand, just as you would with medication, what its limits are, what kind of side effects it has, and where does it fall down? Where is it not to be used? Part of that means to ensure that there's a true signal being captured by validating it against independent populations. So, for example, if we develop a algorithm at UCSF, we should test at University of Chicago. If we develop in the United States, we should test in Europe. And we should understand when and how it fails. There are some extremely important things, though, that then become part of the next tier of concerns. Is the algorithm developed with equity in mind? Because bias occurs, and bias occurs just from the implicitly dynamics of the practice of medicine and practice of life in general. And so if you learn from that, the AI will merely reproduce the unfairness or the inequities that is already embodied in the data. And this can occur across any group or class, but especially needs to be concerned in protected classes. And so ensuring racial fairness, ensuring income equity is involved, that gender is not part and parcel of what we're doing, except when we know that it is. Sexual orientation will increasingly become more important in how this data happens, but even things about immigration status and other social determinants of health. And so any AI really should have a disclosure about that, and that is part of the concern of what needs to happen. These are all examples of a very broad class of bias called availability bias. And that's a distortion that occurs any time that people simply use the data that's most readily available to them, but which is not necessarily truly representative of the target population. And that kind of a bias is possible even beyond protected groups. And so it's important to understand how things were developed. So I think as physicians, it's critically important that as part of the questions you ask as you learn about AI, as you people sell you products and you adopt new services, is what was the source population? Was it used? Does it resemble the population I treat? And is it also part and parcel of the social agenda that we want to achieve in healthcare? It's extremely important sometimes to bring in place mathematical algorithms that supplement and build on the systems that are being built to create this. One example of this in my own work has been a system called BCORS, balancing covariates automatically using supervision. And in essence, the idea really is to treat the protected classes as covariates. And so it's very important that, as you can see here, we have our source data set, we have the population of properties, some of which we're learning from, many of which we are setting aside just simply to measure. As we train this neural network, we're coming up with what is the likelihood of how well someone's therapy is. But as well, we're calculating out all the covariates across the place and seeing how much does each one influence what we're doing. And if necessity, right, you use this to offset the bias in the data. Other examples of how to do this is to subsample. So for example, if you're entirely have a population that is where you're trying to balance unequal sized cohorts, what you do is you subsample the populations down so that the cohorts are equally balanced in size, conduct the study, and then validate. And it's so important to look at this and to challenge the results over and over again. Over the next few years, I'm sure many algorithms will exist, many frameworks, and part of the regulatory frameworks of artificial intelligence will be that goes through these trainings. So AI for healthcare is going to enable enormous improvements. It's going to improve the EHR, it's going to improve our diagnostic tools, it's going to help us identify high-risk patients, it's going to warn of diagnostic medication errors, and it's going to help us monitor patients both inside and outside the clinic. But it's also going to help a lot with the administrative overhead. It's going to accelerate claims and pre-authorization processing, and it's going to be able to predict peaks and enable enormous new types of patient interaction. One of the fun things is the impact on some very classic medical tools, right? So a stethoscope, a tool that has virtually unchanged for 100 years, now can be an AI-enabled stethoscope, where it itself is then part of recording instrumentation, where it is doing and looking for signal that your own ears could not hear, where it can record and compare patient-to-patient intervisits or patient-to-patient across patients' interactions and such. To me, that's amazing. An otoscope, classic, pediatrician look in the ears kind of experience, now can be automated and sent home and part of that. And it's, to me, these are just incredibly fun things. I was amazed the first time I was with a cardiologist and said, "Ted, have you heard about this pocket electrocardiogram?" And he pulled out a live core cardiac device. You've all seen these. It's pretty astounding that these things can then be given to patients themselves is part of the telehealth and the remote patient monitoring revolution that I think is fundamental to this digitization. On the other end of the spectrum is the impact AI is having on electronic health records. An example of this being developed at UCSF, the Medomic system builds on the EPIC system and the Clarity database to extract and build a structured database specific for oncology. It's astounding to me how many different pieces of data and how much data normalization goes into this type of process. The fact that these models then are something that we can then compute over is critical and part of what happens here. An example of that is work done with Dr. Poulter at Duke called the Shield RT AI system. And it's important in that this study was showing the actual benefit in dollars and improved outcomes that patients had, that we could actually achieve a 45% reduction in acute events by seeing patients twice a week instead of once a week after radiation therapy is, I think, just an amazing, a great example of signal that the AI can see. And it's something that can be done, not necessarily knowing all the details of how the AI is functioning or what it's observing, merely identifying the higher risk patients and giving them a little bit of extra tender loving care. To me, this is a great example of the kind of thing where we are focusing our efforts on the patients that need it most. Remote patient monitoring is this entirely new, and I think still, like telehealth was, a very underused technology. And the idea, of course, here is that the phone, watch, other devices actually becomes part of the monitoring system. Today, that signal is not necessarily very clear what to do with it, but it's important to begin and help the patient to maintain therapeutic adherence, to track vitals, to observe signals, and as time goes on, to have the triggers and monitoring system in place to look for changes. There are opportunities here as well, perhaps not to do it at the clinical grade level, but to do things where we can even observe changes. So in the Lifeguard Health Network, for example, they are managing oncology patients in critical care, both in Australia and in Canada. And it's they're able to identify the patients and the need to come in for care long before even the patient necessarily even knows it. Another system, Bina AI, is able to do monitoring of things like blood pressure. At the grade of a clinical grade, no, but good enough to say something is up, please go and actually use a device. And I think this is the type of thing which patients will resonate with. So where are we headed in the future? There are some amazing opportunities for innovation in precision medicine, both early intervention to detect these complex signals and really to begin doing deterministic therapy curation. And that to me is this entirely new approach. Of course, there are also these great new platforms such as mRNA and regenerative medicine, and those are exciting in and of their own minds. Downstairs, I saw several systems from Caris and others, as well as Grail and Freenome, that actually detect signal from circulating tumor DNA, and looking as well at expression data, and looking to see what is changed at levels that no clinical system has looked at before, looking at the methylation fingerprints of very early cancers. This is going to change practice. It means that patients will be coming in earlier with signal, and then either to be put on watchful waiting, as we do in prostate cancer, or to be put on to look for other forms of care. Obviously, this raises some concerns, so we need to learn how to deal with these tools. But the opportunity exists to treat cancers even earlier and hit that zero mortality goal. Nubar Fayan, Dr. Fayan, who's the head of Moderna, came up with this recently quote, that there is now undergoing a shift from probabilistic drug discovery to where we're changing from a multiple shots on goal based pharma business to becoming a deterministic approach enabled by digital technology. What does that mean? It means that that there's this great opportunity now to change the way we discover medications. And this notion here is to compute and reason. Something has happened in the last year or two that I didn't think would be solved in my lifetime. a problem very similar to the protein folding problem, which is still a very hard problem, but the problem of knowing how molecules dock and how they can be unlocked. And so all of a sudden now, we have this great opportunity to use artificial intelligence to identify new drug targets, to identify new ligands and new therapies, and to really explore the therapeutic landscape in ways that were not available even 2 years ago. This is amazing, and this is something where the pharma industry is going to change from, instead of screening millions of compounds to hope to find something that does the right thing, to where they can actually compute the right thing. Another really important thing is what's happening in stem cell therapy. Every hospital has a blood bank. It already knows how to handle tissue. But what we don't have is an organized system for how to have an infrastructure of these kinds of therapies to be created, customized, and widely distributed across the country, around the world. California recognized this. My friend Bob Klein, when stem cell research was canceled by the federal government, said this shall not be, and organized a campaign so that the taxpayers of California would underwrite the bonds for this new agency. This has been running now and has recently received a second infusion of cash to bring the therapies from clinic to from research into the clinic. And this is the kind of investment that I think is going to have astounding payoffs. A few examples of clinical trials going on right now. 47, both at UC San Diego, in doing colorectal and pancreatic cancer, and as well in liver disease. There are approximately 40 different trials undergoing right now in California happening, and I'm very optimistic about this myself. So I'm going to summarize. I think AI tools are really the next step of healthcare digitalization. That these are going to be something that both you'll find perhaps first in the stethoscope, perhaps first in the EHR, perhaps in the medications that you get. Giving advice and guidance to physicians. I predict that within a few years, almost every therapy will be managed or advised by a artificial intelligence software at one level or another. But I think physicians have an important role to play here, and that we need to use the AI tools very carefully. And they need to be used both in concert with the patient's best interests and such, but that the result will be improved outcomes and lower costs. And with that, I'll say thank you and take your questions.